Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another Epic History TV Napoleon episode. This time we're going to be looking at Napoleon's Spanish Ulcer, otherwise known as Napoleon's Vietnam, Spain 1809 to 1811. So at this point, in the last video, I put in the description that this is really the beginning of the end for Napoleon. He's at the top of his game. He's arguably, well, pretty much undisputably the king of Europe. He's made peace with Russia. They joined his continental system. It can't get any better than that, really. But always the British are a thorn in Napoleon's side, and Spain, through its guerrilla warfare, is going to signal the beginning of the end for the Emperor of the French. So I'm very curious to see what this episode's up to. Unlike the other ones that only focuses on 1 year, this one's going to focus on 1809, 1810, and 1811. So without further ado, let's get into it. There you go. See, this war was my downfall. Plainly spoken by the man himself.
In 1809, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, was at the height of his power. He had just won another crushing victory against Austria at Wagram and imposed a humiliating peace treaty. But the war he'd started in Spain and Portugal, with his ill-judged invasion the previous year, continued to rage. Napoleon had placed his own brother Joseph on the Spanish throne, uniting a proud country against him. His troops had dealt ruthlessly with popular uprisings, while routing a succession of Spanish armies. In February 1809, Marshal Lannes overcame the heroic defense of Zaragoza in a brutal siege that cost 54,000 Spanish lives and 10,000 French.
And I've said this before too, and the anti-Napoleon forces, obviously Britain being one of them, Sweden arguably being one as well, are using this as propaganda to push against Napoleon, right? Napoleon being the devil incarnate himself, right? And so obviously with Spain being a heavily religious population, this is not helping Napoleon's cause at all.
But still, the Spanish and Portuguese remained defiant.
Yep.
And 3 months after their escape from Corunna, the British were back. In April, Sir Arthur Wellesley landed in Lisbon to lead a small Anglo-Portuguese army. British redcoats would fight alongside Portuguese troops, who, with the help of British training, would soon prove themselves highly effective.
Yep, that's true.
3 weeks after arriving in Portugal, Wellesley moved against Marshal Soult's Second Corps, which had recently taken Porto. Soult and his troops, preoccupied with plundering the region, had no warning of the British advance, and were soon in headlong retreat, back through the mountains into Spain.
That's an interesting quote. Small armies are defeated in large armies.
Having secured Portugal for the time being, Wellesley planned a joint campaign with General Cuesta, commanding the Spanish army of Extremadura. On the 10th of July, the two commanders met at Casas de Miravete to discuss strategy. Relations between these two allies were not straightforward. Spain and Britain had a long history of conflict. The Spanish were deeply suspicious of British intentions in Spain, while the British had a low opinion of the Spanish army, which they considered poorly trained and badly led.
And yet, the
Wellesley's request to take over command of Spanish forces was rejected, but the generals agreed to a joint advance up the Tagus Valley towards Madrid, to be supported by General Venegas, advancing from La Mancha. In the face of their advance, Marshal Victor's First Corps withdrew to Talavera, where he was joined by King Joseph and General Sebastiani's Fourth Corps. The French plan was for Joseph's army to defend Madrid, while Marshal Soult led 3 corps down from the north to get behind and trap the Anglo-Spanish forces.
I just want to point out here that I find it interesting that Joseph is actually involved in this battle himself. And I remember watching a History Matters video quite a few months ago that I think the question was, when did kings stop participating in battles? And I think it was pretty much around the turn of the century into the 1900s. And I think one of the last times that like a leading member of a country was involved in the battle, I think it was the 1880s or definitely before the First World War, and I think it was before the 20th century. And you just got to think, like, the risk involved here of, you know, Joseph taking a stray bullet, taking a stray cannon shot or something like this, it's got to be really, really high. I mean, that's how Charles XII died, right? The King of Sweden, famously in sort of that manner. Whether he was shot by his own people, who knows? But kind of interesting, and that's something that I've noticed throughout the series here, is how many leaders end up in the battles themselves, and how I guess this is really sort of the closing point of this phenomenon happening, where in the next century it'll pretty much cease to exist at all.
But Joseph, worried by Soult's slow progress and General Venegas's advance on Madrid, decided to attack at Talavera. This video is brought to you by our sponsor, Curiosity Stream,
cool.
Home of more than 2.5...
Yeah, go check out Curiosity Stream. I checked it out once. Not exactly for me, but hey, support the channel, I guess.
The Battle of Talavera saw British infantry bear the brunt of the French assault. They stood firm and repelled the enemy with disciplined musket fire and bayonet charges. Talavera was a small battle compared to the great clashes fought that year in Austria.
True.
But it proved that under Wellesley, Britain's small, well-drilled army was a force to be reckoned with, even though in the short term, victory achieved little. Warned of Soult's approach from captured dispatches, the victorious Anglo-Spanish army retreated, while King Joseph and 4th Corps marched against Venegas's army, which they smashed at the Battle of Almonacid. That autumn, the Supreme Junta in Seville, Free Spain's effective government, raised 2 new armies for another attempt to liberate Madrid,
Where are these men
planning to
coming from?
converge on the capital from north and south. But Wellesley, ennobled as Viscount Wellington for his victory at Talavera, had been so disgusted by the lack of Spanish cooperation that summer that he refused to risk his army. Predictably, Spain's inexperienced armies met with disaster.
Oh, this is not going to be good.
At Ocaña, they suffered their biggest defeat of the war,
Yep.
when a smaller force under Marshal Soult routed the Spanish army, taking 14,000 prisoners and 50 cannon.
Oof.
A week later, the army of the left was heavily defeated at Alba de Tormes. There was more bad news when Girona fell to the French after an epic 7-month siege. The Supreme Junta's plans to retake Madrid were in tatters, and southern Spain was now wide open to French attack.
Cool. Okay, so a year of semi-progress here for the French, it seems, but still, at what cost? I will arrive at a union of hearts.
In January 1810, King Joseph marched south with an army of 60,000 men. Spanish resistance evaporated. Spain's Supreme Junta was overthrown in a coup, as Córdoba and Seville fell without a fight.
Okay, going to
Joseph,
go very
who
well,
still
I
hoped
see.
to win over the Spanish with his progressive reforms, was welcomed by many as a saviour from anarchy. Only Cadiz held out, its defences reinforced by a British naval squadron, and was besieged by Victor's 1st Corps. Meanwhile, Napoleon sent Marshal Massena to Spain with 65,000 reinforcements. He was reckoned one of Napoleon's best marshals, and had just been made Prince of Essling for his heroics in the recent war against Austria. Massena was to lead a 3rd French invasion of Portugal, take Lisbon and chase the British back into the sea. He laid siege to Ciudad Rodrigo, a fortified city controlling one of the main routes into Portugal, which surrendered after 2 weeks' bombardment. Wellington, with only 33,000 men, to face Massena's 50,000, retreated. Massena crossed the Portuguese frontier and besieged Almeida.
I can't even imagine the fighting that's going on through these sieges, man.
13 hours of bombardment. A lucky French shot hit the Portuguese magazine. 70 tons of gunpowder went up in a devastating explosion that made all further resistance useless.
Oh my god. 70 tons?
It was a serious blow to Wellington, who'd been relying on Almeida's strong defences to buy him time. At Busaco, he found a strong defensive position and made a stand.
Okay.
Massena's uphill frontal attack failed, at a cost of 4,000 casualties. But the next day, the French found a way to outflank Wellington's position, and his retreat continued.
Interesting.
As Massena's army neared Lisbon, his scouts reported something completely unexpected.
Oh. Google Earth? That's kind of cool. I don't think I've ever seen Epic History TV use Google Earth. And in none of the new videos they use it either. It's kind of cool. I wonder if this is the only video they're going to use this in.
Stretching across the Lisbon Peninsula, protecting the city from attack, they found a new chain of fortifications in 2 major lines. Known as the Lines of Torres Vedras. The British and Portuguese had been constructing these defences for more than a year. Now the lines bristled with more than 100 forts, redoubts and batteries, manned by 30,000 troops and 250 guns.
This is like the Portuguese Maginot Line.
Massena soon discovered the lines were far too strong for him to attack. What's more, a scorched earth strategy had stripped the surrounding countryside of anything that might help the French.
This will never come up ever again in the campaigns of Napoleon. Nothing to do with scorched earth. Nope. This is the last time. We'll never see this again.
While Portuguese partisans attacked French supply columns as they struggled through the mountains to reach Massena's army.
We'll never see that again either. Nope.
Massena faced a grim predicament. Starved of supplies, too weak to attack, unwilling to retreat.
He's got to retreat.
But throughout this standoff, it was Portuguese peasants who suffered most of all.
Yes.
When their villages and farms were burned, many took refuge in Lisbon, where thousands died of starvation and disease. Back in France, Napoleon had been preoccupied with his divorce from the Empress Josephine, and then a new marriage to Archduchess Marie-Louise, daughter of the Emperor of Austria. She was now expecting their first child. Nevertheless, from Paris, Napoleon sent frequent orders to his marshals in Spain and Portugal, urging them to take more aggressive action. But when these orders arrived, weeks later, they were usually out of date and showed little understanding of the problems his marshals faced. He now ordered Soult, based in Andalusia, to go on the offensive to draw enemy forces away from Lisbon, so Massena could take the city. Soult laid siege to Badajoz, a fortified city that controlled the southern route into Portugal. When 12,000 men of the army of Extremadura marched to its relief, they were routed by Soult, after which the city tamely surrendered, giving up 8,000 prisoners and vast quantities of stores.
Wow.
It was another heavy blow to Spain's armed forces.
I was going to say.
But remarkably, despite such disasters and their many blundering generals, the Spanish troops remained willing to fight, the courage of the rank and file undimmed.
I suppose that does kind of happen when your own mainland is being invaded here. Like, it's not like, British troops that are sending an expeditionary force that are not fighting on their home mainland. Like, this is where you're born and raised, you grew up in, this is where your family is. And obviously you're much more willing to fight to the end than if you were in a foreign land. Not surprising here, really.
Victor's First Corps, besieging Cadiz, had now been so weakened to support other operations that the Anglo-Spanish garrison decided to attack. the Allies landed along the coast to strike at the French siege lines from the rear. But they were ambushed by the French at Barossa. Despite heavy losses, the Anglo-Portuguese rearguard fought off the enemy, but a furious falling out between British commander Sir Thomas Graham and his Spanish counterpart General La Peña threw away any advantage. Soult, alarmed at these developments, marched back to Andalusia. Meanwhile, Massena, out of food and with no prospect of reinforcement, had no option but to retreat.
Oh, Napoleon's not gonna like that.
Wellington's army pursued, discovering evidence of several appalling atrocities committed by the French against Portuguese villagers.
Yep.
There were running battles with the French rearguard, brilliantly commanded by Marshal Ney, until he was sacked by Massena for criticizing his leadership.
No, really?
Having chased the French out of Portugal,
Ney?
Wellington besieged
Oh, what a terrible, terrible idea.
Almeida.
This is not going to go well for Massena, is it?
Massena's army, now rested and reinforced, marched to its aid. The two armies clashed again at Fuentes de Oñoro. In 2 days of heavy fighting, Massena failed to break through Wellington's position to relieve Almeida. The fortress fell the next week, but to Wellington's fury, British bungling allowed most of the French garrison to escape. Massena had lost 25,000 men in Portugal. Now he'd lost Almeida too, and a string of bad decisions, not least to bring his mistress with him on campaign, had cost him the respect of his officers.
Yeah, that's definitely going to boost morale there when you're the only one that brings your companion with you on a military campaign. You know, that sort of seems like something you would learn, you know, in maybe one of the first weeks of being an officer. You know, generally the NCMs and the NCOs don't really like that too much.
The Marshal, whom Napoleon had once nicknamed the Dear Child of Victory, was recalled to France in disgrace, never to hold senior command again.
There you go.
Napoleon sent Marshal Marmont to replace him. Meanwhile, Marshal Beresford, the British commander of Portugal's army, was sent to retake Badajoz with 20,000 British and Portuguese troops.
I kind of wonder, though, is there anything that he could have done? Is there anything that he really could have done? Because that Lisbon line, I mean, unless, you know, the Emperor of the French himself really shows up and pulls up a brilliant tactic. I mean, you have a line here that's being, you know, built for a year, and it's basically like the Portuguese Maginot Line. Is there really anything he could have done? I'm kind of curious, though. Like, if if there's any sort of analysis of the situation that you've read, put it down in the comment section below. I'm actually quite curious.
When Soult approached with a relief force, Beresford marched to meet him at Albuera. It was one of the bloodiest battles of the war. Around 6,000 casualties on each side, with more than a third of the British infantry killed, wounded or captured. Marshal Soult declared,
"There is no beating these troops,
in
spite of their generals. I always thought they were bad soldiers. Now..."
Sorry. That's an interesting French accent.
"Oh, I'm sure of it. I had turned their right, pierced their center, and everywhere victory was mine. But they didn't know how to run."
Soult had been checked, but he
was
determined to save Badajoz. The newly arrived Marshal Marmont marched to his aid, and they advanced again.
I appreciate
this
the
combined
effort.
army forced the British to abandon the siege. But when Wellington withdrew to a strong defensive position across the Portuguese border, Soult and Marmont did not pursue.
Interesting.
French commanders in Spain had learned grudging respect for Wellington and for the steadiness of his troops. For now, the war in Spain had entered stalemate.
General's fortune, officer's ruin, soldier's death. That's gonna boost morale now,
While
isn't
British, French and Spanish armies crisscrossed Spain and Portugal, another war was fought every day in the mountains, hills and woods.
Guerrilla warfare.
From 1808, Spanish and Portuguese civilians, militias and ex-soldiers began taking up arms against the hated French invader. They waged a war of ambushes and hit-and-run raids, known in Spanish as la guerrilla, the Little War. Its fighters became known in English as guerrillas.
Guerrilla warfare.
Britain's Royal Navy supplied vital weapons, stores and money, often landing them behind enemy lines. Much of Spain's rugged countryside fell under the control of the guerrillas. North of Madrid, Juan Martín Díez, an ex-soldier known as El Empecinado, the Stubborn, led a guerrilla band 6,000 strong.
Wow.
In
Those are really impressive
Navarre,
numbers.
Esposimina, a former peasant, ran a highly organised band that caused havoc for the French, capturing convoys and couriers on the strategic Burgos-Bayonne road, and branding Viva Mina on the forehead of collaborators.
Ooh.
While in the west, Julian Sanchez, known as El Charro, led the self-styled Lanceros de Castilla. El Charro himself wore a French hussar's cap,
Nice.
its eagle symbolically turned upside down.
Nice. Power move.
There were dozens more bands operating across Spain, though a few were no better than bandits, terrorizing civilians as often as the enemy.
I mean, still though.
The guerrilla war was merciless, marked by hideous atrocities on both sides.
Yep.
A French soldier's greatest fear was to be taken alive by the guerrillas, who often tortured their prisoners before killing them. Tens of thousands of French troops were tied down by this people's war, guarding outposts or patrolling the countryside.
I know that this is usually referred to as the first ever guerrilla war, but is it truly, truly the first? I mean, was there any other instances of this in history? I mean, you even go back to, the ancient, the Romans, the Byzantines, right? Ancient societies. There must have been some form of this in some other way, no? That's what I kind of wonder. Maybe it was just more, as I said here, more bandits terrorizing the countryside or anything, but I wonder if this really is one of those turning points where it is more like the modern warfare that we understand as guerrilla warfare would be used. I mean, arguably is still used to this day. Kind of wonder about that though, actually.
The roads were so dangerous for French messengers that they required cavalry escorts of 200 men or more.
Wow. Whew.
Many still didn't get through. Their valuable dispatches forwarded to Wellington, for whom they became an invaluable source of intelligence.
Yep.
The war in Spain would ultimately cost the lives of 240,000 French soldiers. As was typical in wars of this era, most died from disease, but more died fighting guerrillas than in battle against the British and Spanish armies.
Wow, that's effective.
However, it
from
was the
Spanish
twin
side.
threat, a well-led regular army under Wellington and a popular insurgency, that left the French facing an impossible strategic dilemma. If their armies remained dispersed to fight the guerrillas, Wellington could attack. But if they concentrated to defeat Wellington in battle,
Of course.
huge swathes of the country would quickly fall to the guerrillas. This was Napoleon's
wicked
Vietnam,
Oh,
or
there
his
you go.
bleeding ulcer, as he called it. A war that cost his empire an average of 100 casualties every day,
Wow.
with little prospect of victory. And in 1812, as Napoleon launched his gigantic invasion of Russia, Wellington and the guerrillas launched their own offensive that would turn the war in Spain on its head.
Wellington strikes Salamanca 1812.
Thank you.
Fascinating. Cool. So I guess that is the next video that's up. That was great. Another fantastic video from Epic History TV. That French voiceover was one of a kind, but hey, we're almost there to that point. Napoleon in Russia. probably some of Epic History TV's finest work, and we're almost there. We're getting there, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm happy that I'll be doing it with you guys. Thank you very much for joining me up to this point. I appreciate you sticking around. Take care. All the best. I'm going to do 3 more videos from here. They're going to be non-Napoleon related, and then we'll be right back to this series here until we get to the very end, including all the Marshals videos. So thank you. Take care. All the best. Have a great week. Till the next one.